So right now you're hearing the drone aspect of the piece, which went up and through the middle of the very top of the arch that you see there. And then there was these more pointillistic sounds that come in later that sort of filled out the edges. And one of the whole purposes of this piece was to, we always think about architecture and sound and the sort of physical properties of sound, which are kind of activated by certain kinds of architecture, right? Like again with the church and all that stuff. But what I'm interested in is making architecture out of sound. So that is what I tried to do here, and it's kind of there's a sort of, back to Levius Woods, the theorist. He often wrote about resistance to structure, and what he meant by that was that certain materials resist structure more than others. So let's say that there's a resistance continuum. On one end of that continuum, there's going to be water and air that has no structure at all. It's completely fluid. And then on the other side of the continuum, we've got basically buildings, like the ones that you see here, that are totally solid. They don't change, unless there's like an earthquake or something like that. But the materials are very solid. They're not porous. You can't get through the walls. I'm going to show you a sort of aerial map of where this was. So this is like the top from above, and to the west of this site was basically all of the downtown buildings. But to the east of this site was the Lake Michigan. So I kind of thought about this Sonambient Pavilion piece as like the middle of that continuum. It was sort of like this bridge that united this complete resistance to structure with the water, with the total just solidity of those buildings. And this was kind of in between, because there are metal pieces that cross. It's a structure, it's architecture, but it's porous. You can get through the walls. And I also wanted to think about, this installation was free to the public. It was in a public space, which is my favorite kind of installation to do. So it was also like, in a social sense, it was also architecture in that it defined why people were there. So if I, wanted to think about the sounds as walls that defined a certain space, and these people were coming into this area, contained in the walls of sound. That's why they were there. So in a sense, that is architecture. It's a social space that is defined by boundaries. And I mentioned before that there are some pointillistic sounds that happen to the sides, which I think will happen in a little bit. One of the reasons I wanted to use these kind of constellations of sound was to almost make like boundary markers on a map, so that when you would hear these distant sounds, because if you can see, the scale of this site is huge. It's like basically like a football field or something. So I wanted to design a piece so that there were like distant kind of twinkling stars of sound coming in and out, which would sort of mark the boundaries of that room of sound, basically. So you could get a sense. It's almost like boundary markers that moved around like monuments. So that was my creation of the actual architecture of the piece. And then, of course, you have the metal material, as I mentioned before, but you also have shapes, these architectural shapes. And you can see here that there are a lot of curves in the metal here, like both in the Gary bandshell and in the trellis, which kind of contrasted in an interesting way with the Bertoia sculptures, which were very straight. And so what I thought about is to sort of superimpose these two kinds of shapes onto one another, to take these sounds that Bertoia made like this and to sort of superimpose them onto this other curved shape. And so I'm superimposing two things. I'm superimposing the sounds, one new soundscape onto an existing soundscape. So of course, like as you're walking around listening to these sounds, you're also hearing other sounds, right? Because it's a park. So you hear kids and dogs and people talking and laughing and cars and ambulances and all those things. So these are two soundscapes that are layered, basically. But of course, the other layering aspect is the layering of the shapes. And that layering is something, again, that happens in a cognitive sense more than a literal sense. So I'm very interested in creating both images and sound images in the mind. So when you think about, like, you get impressions of things. And I think that I think in terms of impressions, so I like to think about these materials or shapes kind of overlaid rather than a more literal aspect or a very strict conceptual kind of approach. So I'm interested in these impressionistic kinds of effects. All right, so I'm gonna keep this going a little bit. Right, so this was open for, I think it was open for a couple months on the weekends. We wish that it could have been open longer,